What is actually going on with Genshin's English voice actors? This isn't my usual kind of topic, but after months of being generally supportive of the strike but a little unaware of the details, this week's events finally pushed me to find the time to dive in. This has now consumed my life for the past several days as I've made a point to go to the original source for everything. The situation has escalated globally to the point where the player base and actors alike are turning on each other, and things are starting to take a really nasty turn. There's a lot of misinformation being spread, and it can be difficult to get a clear picture of what's really going on. Like many, for over a year I saw the surface level discussions and explainers and understood that the strike was just about protections against the use of generative AI and the actors demanding to be paid a fair wage for their work. Both, in my opinion, are important topics and reasonable requests. The studio acting as the middleman between Hoyo and the voice actors were painted as the bad guys. After all, they have an awful track record on previous controversies and were refusing to sign a simple contract which would protect their talent from the end of the voice acting industry as we know it. And Hoyo was seen as avoiding the opportunity to step in and protect the people who do so much to bring their characters to life. Typical greedy corporations, right? Unfortunately, that was just the beginning. The whole issue first came to my attention in September 2023. A vote amongst members of the American Screen Actors Guild, commonly called SAG-AFTRA, granted the union strike authorization in preparation for the next round of negotiations with the union's bargaining partners, signaling that the actors would withdraw their services from the industry at large if an agreement was not reached. Several prominent companies are involved in the negotiations, such as Activision, Electronic Arts, Insomniac, and so on, and one on the list was Formosa Interactive, the studio which handled much of Genshin's English voiceover, amongst other high-profile games. I only looked into the basics at that point, and what I saw made it pretty clear which side was right. It was the latest round in the long fight against hostile use of generative AI in video games, which has been rumbling on in the background for years. Existing contracts were not written with AI in mind. It could be argued that they granted game studios the right to use old recordings of actors' voices and likenesses to train AI models and generate new lines without consent or compensation. This was unacceptable. Actors could lose control over how their voice and face were used in future releases and would be paid nothing beyond their original contracted fees. Even the most free market-minded proponents of AI would be hard-pressed to argue that a person's face and voice should be free to use by large corporations just because they recorded some lines for them at some point in the past. People deserve to be paid for their work. SAG-AFTRA made some very reasonable demands. Explicit consent from the actor prior to AI voice replication. Fair compensation for any AI-generated performances based on an actor's voice. Transparency from studios about when and how AI would be used. And protections against use of prior performances as training data without additional pay. All of that seemed obviously in the right to me. Using someone's voice without their consent is just a no. People deserve to be paid. Of course, companies will always try to find a way to cut corners and weasel out of paying people what they deserve, but that's why unions in general are such an essential part of the fabric of the world. They're one of the few ways that people can collectively bargain, assert their rights, and say no to exploitation. As much as it would be sad for quests in the games I play to be unvoiced during any potential strike, the thought of a future with stolen AI voices ruining the art of video games was a bleak one, so I 100% supported the union's stated intent. Negotiations remained at a stalemate, so the strike began in July 2024. Genshin's voice lines are, of course, recorded months in advance, so at first it had no noticeable effect. But by October, the main Archon quest began to be affected, and several prominent characters were left unvoiced. Over the following months, many people came into my chat and asked why there were voices missing from the game. Every time, my community and I would explain the situation to the best of our ability and talk through why we support the strike even though it was affecting the game we enjoy. After a little while, there were some good signs. Formosa was rumored to have been dropped by Hoyo. There was no official confirmation at the time, but eventually another recording studio called Side Global announced that they would be providing voice production to Genshin. And since that studio has signed onto the interim agreement, which features explicit AI protections, it seemed that the strike would finally be over. When it came to Genshin, at least. Sadly, it was not even close. The strike continued, and as fans, we got no insight into what was happening behind the scenes. People hoped that the studio switch was the light at the end of the tunnel, and that once things got back up and running, everything would return to normal. However, it turns out that the strikes are not just aimed at a specific companies the union originally named, so changing studios didn't make much of a difference. It's particularly complicated in Genshin's case, so more on that later. Skip forward a couple of months, and in March it came out that Kinich had been recast, which finally prompted me to take a closer look. I read the original voice actor's statement, then the one from the new voice actor, and was surprised to see the onslaught of hate that the new actor was receiving. Many fans felt the backlash was unwarranted, and the entire community quickly devolved into mudslinging and uproar. I felt bad for the old actor for losing his job, and for the new one dealing with all the dogpiling, so I really needed to understand what was going on. Why weren't the negotiations moving forwards? Why was this one voice replaced? Was the replacement actually crossing the picket lines, or was there some other explanation? And who was at fault for all this? The discussions were filled with unfamiliar terms like Taft-Hartley, FICO, and scab, and half of what people were saying seemed like misinformation. Time to go digging. The first thing which seemed very confusing was a detail in the statement posted by Kinich's original voice actor. He asserted that Hoyo was refusing to offer AI protections by signing the SAG-AFTRA agreement, which seemed completely at odds with two important facts. First, while Formosa was one of the parties in the negotiation who are refusing to agree to AI protections, to get around that, Hoyo had signed with Site Global, a company which has signed up to the interim agreement which does provide those protections. And second, Chinese law already has AI protections for voiceovers. Way back in April 2024, the Beijing Internet Court ruled that AI-generated voices should be covered by the copyright and personality rights of the voice actor. At a surface level, those laws seem very similar to the protections SAG-AFTRA are asking for. So why were Hoyo being asked to sign it in the first place when they weren't the target of the strike? And why would Hoyo refuse to sign a contract which states they need to do something which they already need to do by law? While we can't know for certain, there's a lot of speculation based on publicly available sample documents put out by SAG-AFTRA and some guidance documents they have also produced. So, of course, I got to reading. First, what do SAG-AFTRA claim are the points of contention in the contract negotiations? On their page detailing the strike, they say that while they have found some common ground, there are multiple key areas where the employer's proposals are filled with loopholes, while the language the union want is transparent and enforceable. They link to this document, which shows the different language proposed by each side, both in legalese and in plain language for both sides. Having read through it, I have to agree with the union's perspective on the points listed in the doc. I highly recommend reading it for yourself. It's not all that long, and with the plain language explanations, it's easy to see that the points they're making are objective and highlight clear issues which should be resolved. In summary, the language they're proposing defines clear boundaries and covers eventualities with explicit and clear terms, while the employer's proposal avoids these things and leaves scope for exploitation. But from what I can gather, these are exactly the kinds of protections which Hoyo are already legally obligated to provide. I totally believe that the American corporations are pushing for the inclusion of these loopholes, but it seems weird to suggest that this is the sticking point preventing Hoyo from signing given those two important facts I mentioned earlier. Instead, many people speculated that the actual problem is a little deeper in the sample contract intended for projects like Genshin, called the Independent Interactive Localization Agreement. Section 6 of the ILA sample is called Union Security and asserts that the employer will only employ members of SAG-AFTRA and will be subject to fines and arbitration if they employ any performer who is not a member of the union. That is clearly a big deal. However, there are a couple of caveats to it. The first is the Taft-Hartley Act. This is an American law passed in 1947 intended to restrict the power of unions and protect employer rights, one aspect of which was to prohibit closed shops, where only union members could be hired. Under this law, the union must provide a process which allows non-union actors to take part in the project. For a union project to hire a non-union actor, they need to notify the union in writing. If approved, this allows the actor to work that role for 30 days. After the 30 days, plus potentially some additional 30-day extensions, the union now classifies them as must join, and in order to continue the job, they would be obligated to join the union. Note that an actor only has this one exemption available in their entire career, with some rare exceptions, and after they've used them up, they must either join the union or never work a union project again. And it's worth noting that the union fees are expensive. Their annual dues aren't too bad. They have a base amount of just over $200 plus a small percentage of covered earnings. But the joining fee is $3,000. The union offers loans to spread the cost of the joining fee over the course of a couple of years, of course, but that's an amount that many people would not be able to dispose of lightly. The second caveat is the possibility of waivers. The union has stated that for non-union actors already working a role in one of these projects, they will negotiate a waiver for the must-join status to allow them to continue in their role. However, this still feels very uncomfortable. The union is essentially asking the game developer to hand over the right to determine whether their existing actors are allowed to remain in their job and just trust that they won't change their minds. This is a line I always draw during contract negotiations. If the other party says I can trust them to do something, then they should be comfortable setting that forth in writing. If they want its scope to be limited, then that's fair enough, but commitment and transparency is vital, and a refusal to be specific here is not a good look. Despite these two caveats, it's hard to see any reasonable argument that this section of the contract does not constitute a closed-shop policy. For ongoing hiring, any project which signs up to it would, to all intents and purposes, only be allowed to hire members of SAG-AFTRA in the long term. I've seen many members of the union state that this is a good thing, since it ensures that the union has true leverage and is able to actually make a difference. They claim that if this were not the case, nobody would join the union and all the protections it provides would become financially unsustainable. As a European, this seems like a really odd take. Over here, in most countries, closed shops are actually illegal, and loopholes like this, which create a closed shop in all but name, would not be tolerated. People want the freedom to choose whether or not they want to be part of a union, regardless of whether they want to work at any particular job. Those two decisions are supposed to be separate. There are many reasons that closed shops are problematic, including issues like limited employment opportunities, high fees, reduced flexibility, bureaucracy, and so on, many of which seem to be hinted at in this situation to us outside observers. And yet, unions are still a thing over here. People still join and pay their dues, even though those who don't join are still able to work the same jobs and reap the same benefits. If anything, the unions are stronger in Europe. And honestly, having looked deeper into SAG-AFTRA, I've never seen a more un-union-like union in my life. It's also important to note that it is in the union's best interest for non-union members to be covered by the same protections. For the industry to survive, AI protections must become an industry standard, since otherwise developers may just decide to contract with basically anyone who will let them use their voice to train AI without providing proper compensation. If you're unconvinced, consider if, for example, the union were to amend this requirement to allow up to a certain percentage of people working on any given project to be fully exempt from any union requirements. We could debate what percentage would be appropriate, but even if the union only spoke for a significant slice of the workforce, its ability to effect change would still be a force to be reckoned with. Obviously, the US legal landscape is a totally different world. But Hoyo is not an American company. While even if they did become a signatory, they would still be able to hire non-union actors from outside of the US, clearly they are not interested in directly hiring people within the US and would prefer to work through signatory intermediaries like Side Global. Asking them to become a union signatory just does not make any sense from an outside perspective, regardless of how you feel about the pros and cons of the union itself. There are even some corrections shared from the Chinese community that claim that Hoyo might not legally be able to sign the contract with SAG-AFTRA in the first place, because every union active in China must be affiliated with the All China Federation of Trade Unions. If that's true, then they may not even have a choice. The most frustrating part of all of this is that these legitimate questions are not being answered by anyone involved, so we can only speculate. Yet the people who could explain are pointedly ignoring the questions or even insulting people just for having the nerve to ask for clarification. Before we get back to the dumpsterfire that started this all off, there are a couple of other quirks which are worth taking a look at. First, why didn't switching studios make a difference? Genshin is not a union project. Hoyo have never signed a contract with SAG-AFTRA, and they work with a wide variety of voice actors from across the world. Turns out that, technically speaking, any member of the union who was previously working with Genshin was breaking the Global Rule 1 of the union. They're explicitly not allowed to work non-union projects, and they risk fines or expulsion if they do. The union generally turned a blind eye to this, at least partly because they didn't consider video game voice acting to be important, but it seems that may have changed. This also means that Genshin was never a direct target of the strike. However, during strike action, the union is much stricter about enforcing the rules, and actors are under much greater scrutiny. Now that Hoyo are partnered with Side Global, who have signed the interim agreement, and therefore who can record union actors, it's unclear why many actors are unable to return, and why they are calling for Hoyo themselves to become signatories. Second, how is it that some of the union voice actors are returning while others are still on strike? There are actually two tiers of union membership, full membership and something called FI-Core. Both pay the dues, but FI-Core members opt out of receiving many of the benefits of the union, and in exchange they are allowed to work both union and non-union jobs, including any which are struck. The union does discourage this practice and considers FI-Core actors dues-paying non-members and scabs, and there is stigma against actors who follow this path. We have no way to know which actors are FI-Core and which are not, but this may explain why some are willing to return now that Hoyo are working with a studio which has signed up for AI protections. So, why are some roles getting recast? As a non-union project, this entire time, Hoyo would have been perfectly within their rights to recast any union actors. The fact that they haven't is quite telling. They clearly want to continue working with their existing actors. That may be due to a fear of community backlash, or it may be for other reasons, but it's undeniable that they have been very patient. I am not one to champion multi-billion-dollar corporations, but painting them as the villain in this situation feels like misdirection. It's unlikely that they are interested in becoming a union project for all the various reasons outlined previously, but at the same time, it would be a risky move to recast a role held by a union actor, especially if it were a long-standing and beloved character. Instead, unless I'm mistaken here, because it's hard to figure out the union status of any given person, they have replaced a handful of actors across their games who have been striking, but who aren't SAG-AFTRA members. These actors were striking in solidarity, perhaps without realizing that if the union gets what they want, their continued employment would be at the mercy of the union's bureaucracy. Hoyo probably felt that replacing them was a much lower risk because the union does not care about them at all, and doing so let them gauge their fans' reactions without igniting the ire of all the union actors. Kinich in particular was only voiced for a single patch, so the relationship there was, unfortunately, even more tenuous. It absolutely sucks that anyone lost their job to this. It sucks that someone trying to do the right thing and support their colleagues paid the price. I hope that this will end up as just a minor blip in his long and successful career. It's difficult to draw conclusions when we don't know the exact details of what's happening behind closed doors, and it's certainly possible that the actual sticking points for Hoyo specifically are something entirely different to what we've talked about here. However, I can't help but feel that solidarity strikes are misguided. The strike is, supposedly, about AI protections. Hoyo are based in a country with AI protections enshrined in law, and they're now hiring English VAs through a company who require AI protections in their contracts. Maybe there are concerns with the specifics of those protections, but that remains a different issue to the terms being negotiated by the American corporations. Since Hoyo are not actually doing the thing that the strike is supposedly aimed to prevent, wouldn't it make more sense for a non-union voice actor to compare the protections Hoyo currently commit to with the stated goals of the strike, rather than just waiting for the union to get everything it's asking for? If the AI protections are robust, then Hoyo have done the right thing, and there would arguably be no reason to continue the strike on that particular project. Crossing the picket line is a fraught and dangerous decision which undercuts the collective power of the people. But when it comes to Genshin, there seems to be legitimate questions as to whether there is a picket line there in the first place. If someone were to make it clear that they're only comfortable going back to work because not only is the project not struck in the first place, the new contract does provide the protections that the strike is requesting, then it would be hard to sympathize with people who remain offended. Which brings us to the dumpster fire that is the community right now. For this part of the discussion, we need to introduce the term scab. A scab in this context is someone who works during a strike, either by crossing the picket line or by outright replacing a striking worker. Scabs are controversial figures because they are workers who are not aligned with others who are fighting for their rights. Being labeled as a scab can be serious harm to an actor's career, since they instantly become unpopular with union colleagues, and their chances of getting union jobs in the future are much lower. When it came to Kinich's new voice actor, many union actors taking part in the strike were extremely offended and attacked them vocally in public. Ignoring the vitriol, I can see both sides here. On the one hand, someone breaking a strike by taking someone else's job is not something anyone who works for a living should be happy to see. The AI protections the union are requesting are clear and reasonable and essential if we want the industry to survive. But on the other, this was a job which was explicitly not covered by the strike for a role previously taken by a non-union non-union actor for a company based on a completely different continent. The person who took the job lives in Japan and claims they weren't even aware of the strike. There's a high chance he didn't even know what role he was auditioning for until he got the job, and it seems unlikely that he would be told why the previous actor was leaving. Regardless of his knowledge of the strike, I would be unsurprised if the first time he knew what actually happened was when he posted his announcement and saw the hate flood in. Furthermore, while I sympathize with the anger of the VA seeing one of their colleagues ousted, I honestly felt ill watching it all unfold. People with large followings ganging up on one person publicly instead of at least trying to reach out privately first to find out more about the situation. There are further reasons to see their vocal witch hunt as very misguided. Several existing voice actors are also arguably crossing the picket lines themselves, so depending on their union status, they might actually be breaking the strike. This includes some who are central to the witch hunt against the new VA. Taking a role from another VA is obviously more severe than someone working in an existing role in violation of the strike, if the new actor knew the circumstances. But either way, it's a bad look for the community to be dogpiling on the new guy while ignoring others in their midst who are committing a similar sin in full knowledge of the situation. On the other hand, the people defending the new VA also took it way too far, slinging hate and allegedly even death threats at those who were angry. This whole situation is just awful, and very few have handled it with any semblance of professionalism. I thought we could expect better from the VA community. So where will things go from here? There are a few possible outcomes, and it may even be a completely new voice in the conversation which has the last word. According to some discussions, this whole situation has gone down in the Chinese community like a lead balloon, and the players there are very angry at the way SAG-AFTRA and the union VAs are treating Hoyoverse. Supposedly, many of the players are threatening to drop the game entirely if Hoyo don't recast those roles, and may have already uninstalled the game in protest, and we all know just how much Hoyo tends to listen to the whims of its Chinese player base. If they get their way, then we might see a very quick pivot on the part of Hoyo. If they don't, then there are a few main possibilities. First, a long-term stalemate, where the current situation just drags on for years. In this scenario, non-union VAs would remain unaffected, and FI-core members would probably return over time as dictated by their personal financial situations and perspectives on the strike, while full members would end up with a stark choice. Either make the switch to FI-core, go back to work and risk their union membership, or accept that they will never return. Second, the strike could end without an agreement signed with Hoyoverse specifically. This would be possible if the companies which are explicitly being struck were to sign the agreements. For example, there's two different takes on this scenario. If SAG-AFTRA decide that video game voice acting really is a small fry from their perspective and go back to not caring, things would return to how they were before the strike began. If they don't, and they continue to pay attention, then, since the game would remain non-union, the union actors would be forced to make the same choice between losing their job and becoming FI-core or leaving the union. Third, the strike could succeed with Hoyoverse signing up as a union project, presumably for the English voiceover only. Here, union VAs would be happy, but non-union VAs would just have to hope that the union would let them keep their jobs, and future roles would be closed shop in all but name, limited to people who are able and willing to pay into SAG-AFTRA. And finally, the union could compromise on their union security clause. They could follow the norm in much of the rest of the world and allow union jobs to hire non-union workers. In this situation, everybody wins. Union VAs would return, non-union VAs would be unaffected, and future hires would be able to choose between joining the union or remaining independent. I would like to believe in unions. I am firmly against the use of generative AI to replace real artists and actors. I'm fully behind the fight for fair compensation and informed consent. But there's so much here which seems concerning, and much of the behavior I've seen is so disappointing. If you care about this subject at all, don't take anyone else's word for it. Don't take my word for it. I'm sure there are things I've missed or misunderstood, and the same will go for anyone. Read the documents with an open mind and try to see all sides. And no matter where you end up on the spectrum of perspectives, don't send hate and death threats. We should all be better than that. Until next time.